Hey everyone, Karolyne Roberts here and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, I'm finally going to be sharing my full testimony of finding Christ and how I came to know God. So if you're interested in learning more about my journey and how I got saved, then definitely stay tuned. So I want to start off by sharing a little bit more about my background. So I am a first generation American. My mother and father are from the islands. My mom specifically from the island of Haiti and my dad is from Jamaica. So my mom moved to America when she was a young girl and they ended up having me. They were never married, but they did have me at a young age, and I grew up in a single parent household. I was mainly raised by my mom. Growing up, I did get to see my dad, even though it was not as often as I would have liked, but he had a wife and he ended up building his own family, which I'm super happy because I got an amazing brother and sister out of it. But now that I look back, I'm just super grateful for my life and for the trials and tribulations that I have faced, because I believe that it has made me a stronger woman. And I model after my mom. She is a hard worker. She's super independent, super motivated and focused. So I get a lot of my ambition and focus and motivation by modeling after my mother. She was very hardworking and she made sure that me and my sisters always had food on the table and a roof over our heads, and that we always had a very good education. Growing up, I was raised in the church. My godmother, who is also my aunt, she was very heavily active in church, and she still is today. She is a minister, and she taught me a lot about the faith. She taught me a lot about scripture. And I just remember as a young girl, she made sure that we went to church because we lived with her at a point. And, we lived around the same neighborhood as her at a point. So my family is very close knit. Especially growing up, we were always very, very close. And I think it's that way with a lot of Caribbean families. So my aunt was basically like a second mom to me. And I remember that she took us to church every single Sunday. So I did grow up in church and I had basic knowledge of Christianity and the gospel. But it wasn't until later down the road that I truly started a real relationship with Jesus Christ. And that is why I am sharing my testimony. So basically, my testimony is going to be sharing my journey from just growing up in church to getting to that point where I was like, I don't want to just do the religious acts. I don't want to just go to church, but I want to have a true and sincere relationship with God, and I want to live a transformed life. So that is basically what I'm going to share in this video. So in this next part of my testimony, I want to share with you how sin and shame entered into my life and really had me going down the wrong path. So when I was young, probably in about first grade or kindergarten, I was really young, I was molested at a very young age. And this is something that I've obviously healed from, but it is a big part of my testimony. Being molested opened the door to a lot of things. In elementary school, shortly after I was molested, I was introduced to same-sex attraction, and that opened up the door for homosexuality in my life. I remember specifically two separate instances where girls would take me into the bathroom stall, and I'm not going to go into further detail, but that basically exposed me to homosexual attraction. So I was molested, and as a child, I was opened up to experimenting with sexuality at a very young age. And then my aunt, the one who I told you guys about, who took us to church every Sunday, she ended up moving to Oklahoma to go to Bible college. And I remember the first year that she was gone, I missed her so much. I missed my cousin so much. So I was literally asking my mom if I could go to Oklahoma to live with my aunt. So I went to Oklahoma to live with my aunt, and I have spent a few years living in Oklahoma. Now, living in Oklahoma, it kind of opened up a can of worms. It was a good environment in terms of my aunt. She really made sure that we went to church every Sunday. That is where I learned the books of the Bible and was able to memorize them. That is where a lot of seeds were planted, and I believe that God was really pursuing me. But I didn't realize that I was already dealing with a spirit of rejection, because growing up in a single parent household and not truly having the relationship with my father that I desired to have, and the few times that I went to visit my father, his wife at the time, if I could just be honest, she was not the nicest person, and she made me feel like literally the stepchild. She made me feel rejected, and I dealt with that spirit of rejection very heavily. So one of the things that I always desired growing up was love, was acceptance, and that is what I strived for. And it wasn't until later down the road that I finally realized that all this love and all this acceptance that I had been seeking all this time could only come through God. So fast forward, I'm living in Oklahoma, and while I'm there, this is my first time being exposed to porn. I was in middle school at this time, and it was by accident. I was browsing the internet trying to look for cheerleading videos or cheerleading tips, because I have been a cheerleader throughout middle school and high school. And as I was browsing, I came across a pornographic website, and that was my first encounter with porn. And ever since then, everything added up, from being molested to being exposed to homosexual attraction to being exposed to porn. Slowly after that, I would feed off of the porn. I would intentionally go into porn chat rooms or porn websites, and it grew into this literal addiction because I fed off of that lust, and I felt like it fulfilled me for a moment, but then I would feel empty. And then when you feel empty, it leaves you wanting more and more, because you're looking for these things to fulfill you. And I have, another video on my website where I'm talking about how God freed me from, porn addiction, and that video specifically focuses on that. But in this video, I just want to share my full testimony, and that is just a snippet of one of the things that God has delivered me from and that He's freed me from. But in the midst of all of this spirit of rejection became even more heavy upon me in my life, because living in Oklahoma and just the neighborhood we lived in, the schools we went to, I was literally one of the few African American children in my school, one of the few who looked like me. So I constantly felt like I wasn't enough. I used to get perms all the time. I felt like my hair wasn't straight enough. I felt like even though I'm light skinned, I felt like my skin wasn't light enough. Like I just did not fit in. I didn't fit in with the dress, the style. Like I was just an outsider, and I just didn't feel accepted. Even before moving to Oklahoma in middle school, when I lived in Florida, I was picked on a lot. A lot of people used to make fun of me because of my mole, and there were other things that they made fun of me for as well. But I was picked on and made fun of in school, and the one thing about me is that I've always been very goofy. So it's something that a lot of people don't know about me, but I've always been very goofy. I like to laugh, I like to dance, I like to have fun. And in middle school, I would be very goofy, and instead of people laughing with me, because I wanted to make people laugh, I wanted to make people have fun, they would laugh at me. So I felt that rejection, and I kind of closed down, and I was like, okay, I can't be goofy. I can't, I think my rejection probably had a lot to do with why I became very introverted, and I'm very introverted now. Because of my past of rejection. So I usually just keep to myself, and I have a few very, very close friends who I confide in and that I feel comfortable fully being myself around. These are all of the things that I dealt with in my past, and it was just a ripple effect. Everything just opened up the door to another sin, just opened up the door to something else. And eventually I ended up moving back to Florida. And when I moved back to Florida, it was like a culture shift. It was like a complete change. Florida is a melting pot. If you do not know, there are people from all over the world in Florida, especially South Florida, and there are people from the islands. It's a melting pot. So no longer did I feel left out, and I started to get attention. So I moved to Florida around the time that I was growing and developing into a young woman, and my body started to change, and my hair was growing, and I was growing, and I started to get attention, and this is where everything began to ramp up. So as I was getting attention, I started dating, really jumping from relationship to relationship. Even though I had long-term relationships, I always had to be in a relationship. I always had to have someone that I was on the phone with. I always felt like I needed someone there to give me that attention. So I was hardly ever single during that time, and everything was just getting worse. My porn addiction was getting worse. I, would lie to my mom to meet guys. I would sneak out of the house. So it was getting pretty bad to a point. So this is the point where it all changed for me. I want to talk about how it all changed for me and how I finally came to God. So I was in a relationship, one of my long-term relationships. I was in this relationship for a while, but everything started out like a fairy tale. Everything started out like it seemed perfect. I thought this guy was the one, right? But that relationship eventually went sour. And when I say sour, this was a relationship where I experienced verbal and mental abuse, being talked down to, being discouraged, being threatened that if I left this relationship, the man that I was with threatened that he would commit suicide. So there was this big, heavy weight that I felt like I was stuck. I felt like I couldn't get out of that relationship. And I remember just praying to God. So now all these seeds that have been planted, all these years where God was pursuing me, all of these seeds of my aunt taking me to church and me hearing about the gospel, it's like all of it was leading up to this very moment. And I prayed to God, and I said, and this was around in that year, this was around the 4th of July. And I remember like the theme was like freedom and liberty. I'll always remember I got saved around the 4th of July. And this was like probably the day of or the day after 4th of July. And I said, God, if you set me free from this relationship, I will serve you with my life. I will finally decide to have a relationship with you. And the very next morning, my boyfriend texted me and he said, I had a dream that we broke up. And I was like, wow, maybe it's a sign from God. And he said, yeah, I think that we should stop talking. And just like that, the relationship was over. And it's like I had been telling him for weeks, for a while, that I don't feel safe in this relationship. I don't think we should be together. And he refused to let me go. And for it to just happen and for our breakup to go so smoothly, it was all God. And that was the day that I considered myself saved. That was the day that I made an intentional and conscious decision to start a relationship with God. So things weren't perfect. The next steps I got a Bible and I started reading the Bible. I got plugged into a church. At this time, I had my permit and, my own car, and I was driving myself to church. I had no one taking me to church. I had no one dragging me to church. My aunt wasn't there. She lived in Oklahoma. So it was just myself deciding I'm going to wake up and go to church. So I got into a church that was very heavy in Bible teaching. So I think that church has a lot to do with my foundation today. I love to teach the Bible. I love to break things down. I have a whole YouTube video on how to study the Bible, but I think that's what I needed in that season. My pastor would always break everything down. He would talk about the Greek and the Hebrew, and this is the first time that I actually started serving in church. So I started volunteering. I started serving on the praise team. My whole life literally began to change, and God started to convict me about those things, those secret sins, because they were secrets. My mom, my family, my friends, no one knew that I was struggling with this. Everyone thought Karolyne is this perfect, good girl. She doesn't struggle with anything. She gets good grades in school. She's a good girl. But no one knew that, I was dealing with rejection. No one knew that I was addicted to porn. No one knew that, deep down inside, sometimes I'd be attracted to girls. Like, no one knew these thoughts that I had in my head. No one knew what I was struggling with because I never shared it. I was never open and transparent. And one thing about the Bible is that it says, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. The fervent prayer of the righteous one is powerful and effective. And I finally came into a place where I started to express myself. I started to confess. I started writing poetry and sharing my testimony and sharing the gospel, and that confession started to break me free, started to put me at liberty. And it was a journey. It took 2 to 3 years of fighting against that porn addiction to break it. I have never watched porn since after that time. But I have very, very strict boundaries. Like, if you ask my husband, some people can watch rated R movies. You can watch whatever you want to watch, listen to whatever you want to listen to, but I know my past. I know where I came from. I know what God delivered me from. I cannot expose myself to everything. I have to guard my eyes, guard my heart, guard my mind. So I take it very seriously, and I'm never going back. And the enemy, he'll try to tempt you. He'll try to tempt you to go back to your past. He'll try to tempt you to go visit some website. But if you keep falling into that temptation, then you can't help someone else break free. You can't be a voice to someone else because you're going to be covered with that shame. So I'm so glad that I'm not covered with that shame. I'm so glad that God set me free, and now I can share my testimony to let someone else know that it is possible. And I ended up finally becoming single and focusing on my relationship with God and growing with Him and finding that wholeness and finding that contentment in Him. And now, as I am in my marriage, coming to 7 years of my marriage, God gave me the desires of my heart. He knows that I wanted something different for my life. He knows that I wanted to change the trajectory of my life and my future for generations to come. And I said, you know what, God, I want a family. I want a husband. I want to do things your way. I am not bound to my past. I'm not bound to what my parents went through, what my grandparents went through. But I make a decision today to change the trajectory for future generations to come. And I'm so thankful that God has enabled me by His grace and by His power and His strength to do just that. I'm truly thankful, and I'm a living testimony of deliverance. I think that's why I'm so passionate about deliverance, because God literally delivered me from this addiction, from same-sex attraction, from all this stuff. Like, I have been free for years, for more than a decade. I've been free, for more than a decade, and I'm never going back. And that is my testimony of how I came to know God. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this video encouraging. If you did, leave it a thumbs up. And if it's your first time on my channel, do not forget to subscribe. I love you guys so much, and I'll see you in my next YouTube video. Until next time, bye.